in which growing maturity rekindles the relationship between one pair of lovers, and self-absorption carries another pair to the brink of death. Chapter 13. When they got up from the table, Levine wanted to follow Kitty into the drawing room, but he was afraid that she might be displeased by such all too obvious courtship of her on his part. He remained in the men's circle, taking part in the general conversation, but without looking at Kitty, sensed her movements, her glances, and the place where she was in the drawing room. He began at once, and without the slightest effort, to fulfill the promise he had given her, always to think well of all people and always to love everyone. The conversation turned to village communes, in which Pestsov saw some special principle which he called the choral principle. Levine agreed neither with Pestsov nor with his brother, who had some way of his own of both agreeing and disagreeing with the significance of the Russian commune. But he talked with them, trying only to reconcile them and soften their objections. He was not the least bit interested in what he said himself, still less in what they said, and desired only one thing, that they and everyone should be nice and agreeable. He now knew the one important thing, and that one thing was at first there in the drawing room, and then began to move on, and stopped by the door. Without turning round, he felt a gaze and a smile directed at him, and could not help turning. She was standing in the doorway with Sherbatsky, and looking at him. "I thought you were going to the piano," he said, approaching her. "That's what I lack in the country. Music." "No, we were only coming to call you away, and I thank you," she said, awarding him a smile as if it were a gift, "for having come. What's all this love of arguing? No one ever convinces anyone else." "Yes, that's true," said Levine. "It most often happens that you argue hotly, only because you can't understand what precisely your opponent wants to prove." Levine had often noticed in arguments between the most intelligent people that after enormous efforts, an enormous number of logical subtleties in words, the arguers would finally come to the awareness that what they had spent so long struggling to prove to each other had been known to them long, long before, from the beginning of the argument, but that they loved different things and therefore did not want to name what they loved, so as not to be challenged. He had often felt that sometimes during an argument you would understand what your opponent loves, and suddenly come to love the same thing yourself, and agree all at once, and then all reasonings would fall away as superfluous, and sometimes it was the other way round. You would finally say what you yourself love, for the sake of which you are inventing your reasonings, and if you happen to say it well and sincerely, the opponent would suddenly agree and stop arguing. That was the very thing he wanted to say. She wrinkled her forehead, trying to understand, but as soon as he began to explain, she understood. I understand. You must find out what he's arguing for, what he loves, and then you can... She had fully divined and expressed his poorly expressed thought. Levine smiled joyfully. So striking did he find the transition from an intricate, verbose argument with his brother in Bessov to this laconic and clear, almost wordless communication of the most complex thoughts. Sherbatsky left them, and Kitty, going over to an open card table, sat down, took a piece of chalk in her hand, and began to trace radiating circles on the new green cloth. They resumed the conversation that had gone on at dinner about the freedom and occupations of women. Levine agreed with Darya Alexandrovna's opinion that a girl who did not get married could find feminine work for herself and her family. He supported it by saying that no family can do without a helper, that in every family, poor or rich, there are and must be nannies hired from the family. No, said Kitty, blushing, but looking at him all the more boldly with her truthful eyes. A girl can be in such a position that she cannot enter a family without humiliation, while she herself... He understood from a hint. Oh, yes, he said, yes. You're right. And he understood all that Pestsov had been maintaining at dinner about women's freedom, only because he saw the fear of spinsterhood and humiliation in Kitty's heart. And, loving her, he felt that fear and humiliation, and at once renounced his arguments. Silence ensued. She went on tracing on the table with the chalk. Her eyes shone with a quiet light. Obedient to her mood, he felt in his whole being the ever-increasing tension of happiness. I've scribbled all over the table, she said, and putting down the chalk, made a movement as if she wanted to get up. How can I stay alone? Without her, he thought with horror, and he took the chalk. Wait, he said, sitting down at the table. There's one thing I've long wanted to ask you. He looked straight into her tender, though frightened eyes. Please do. Here, he said, and wrote the initial letters W, Y, A, M, T, C, B, D, I, M, N, O, T. These letters meant, when you answered me, that cannot be. Did it mean never or then? There was no likelihood that she would be able to understand this complex phrase, but he watched her with such a look as if his life depended on her understanding these words. She glanced at him seriously, then leaned her knitted brow on her hand and began to read. Occasionally she glanced at him, asking with her glance, Is this what I think? I understand, she said, blushing. What is this word? He said, pointing to the end that signified the word never. That means the word never, she said. But it's not true. He quickly erased what was written, gave her the chalk, and got up. She wrote T, I, C, G, N, O, A. Dolly was completely consoled in her grief, caused by her conversation with Alexey Alexandrovich, when she saw these two figures, Kitty, chalk in hand, looking up at Levine with a timid and happy smile, and his handsome figure bent over the table, his burning eyes directed now at the table, now at her. He suddenly beamed. He had understood it. It meant, then I could give no other answer. He glanced at her questioningly, timidly. Only then? Yes, her smile replied. And now? He asked. Well, here. Read this. I'll tell you what I would wish very much. She wrote the initial letters T, Y, C, F, A, F, W, H. It meant that you could forgive and forget what happened. He seized the chalk with his tense, trembling fingers, and breaking it, wrote the initial letters of the following: I have nothing to forgive and forget. I've never stopped loving you. She glanced at him, the smile staying on her lips. I understand, she said in a whisper. He sat down and wrote a long phrase. She understood everything, and, without asking him if she was right, took the chalk and replied at once. For a long time he could not understand what she had written, and kept glancing in her eyes. A darkening came over him from happiness. He simply could not pick out the words she had in mind, but in her lovely eyes shining with happiness, he understood everything he needed to know, and he wrote 3 letters. But she was reading after his hand, and before he finished writing, she finished it herself and wrote the answer, yes. Playing secretaire, said the old prince, approaching. Well, come along, anyhow, if you want to make it to the theater. Levine stood up and saw Kitty to the door. In their conversation, everything had been said. That she loved him, that she would tell her father and mother, that he would come tomorrow in the morning. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.